Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everyone, dear attendees, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning for the second day of the Net Zero International Conference. Today, the theme of the day will be from pledges to implementation. But let me, at the beginning, introduce myself. My name is Yasmin Mansour. I'm AUC Sustainability Director. And let me give you some practices or rules and regulations for the American University in Cairo. AUC, it's a campus, a smoking-free campus. We cannot smoke within the premises of the AUC. If you want to smoke, you have to go outside the gate and smoke between the inner fence and the outer fence. You will find the smoking areas. So please, we are campus-free. Smoking, and we do care about the waste. So you will find sorting stations across the AUC to put your plastic bottles and to have a responsible action about our waste. So you will find the sorting stations across the different places at the American University in Cairo. This is the first thing. Thank you. Today I will give you a plan about the day. We will have 2 keynote speakers, and then we will have 3 sessions. Session regarding the net zero solid waste, and third session will be net zero water and wastewater, and the fourth session will be net zero and decarbonization. Each session we will have like 4 speakers and then a panel with the speakers, and the floor will be open to the audience to ask the speakers about their presentations and the topic, and you have any comments or anything, you can share it with the speakers. Now we will start with our first keynote speaker, Dr. Victoria Burrows. This speech will be a recording one, and she is the Director of Advancing Net Zero at World Green Building Council, and the topic will be Advancing Net Zero World GBC. We can start now.
Hello, my name is Victoria Burrows. I'm Director of Advancing Net Zero at the World Green Building Council, and I'm really pleased to speak to you today for the Net Zero International Conference, and a huge thank you for the invitation from Egypt GBC, and particularly as your focus is on ACT for Net Zero. So I'm really pleased to be able to share with you a little bit about what World Green Building Council is doing, our Advancing Net Zero program, and the work of our GBCs and partners from around the world. So World Green Building Council is the world's most influential local, regional, and global action network leading the sustainable transformation of the built environment. And together with our 75 green building councils, we are driving systemic change to address whole life carbon emissions in existing and new buildings, enable resilient, healthy, and equitable and inclusive places, and secured regenerative, circular, and resource-efficient infrastructure for our future. The Advancing Net Zero program is a campaign to accelerate total decarbonisation by 2050. And we do this by increasing the awareness and education around the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings. We work to achieve alignment and commonality between GBC approaches and certification schemes, and to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples. So why is this important? Well, we know that the latest figures are telling us that the building and construction industry globally is responsible for 37% of energy-related emissions, around the same of energy demand, and about half of materials consumption and extraction, and around half of that again is wasted. Of 192 nationally determined contributions submitted by governments as part of the COP process, 136 mention buildings and emission reductions, but only 80 countries have adopted energy codes. And where we're expecting to see the most amount of growth between now and 2060, as we're doubling the world's building stock, in those markets, around 66% of them lack mandatory building codes at all. So the World Green Building Council's whole life carbon vision combines the concepts of operational carbon and embodied carbon, to set out the best practice principles in addressing emissions from this sector. So firstly, with operational carbon, we must prioritize energy efficiency to reduce and optimize energy demand. And then we must meet that remaining balance from renewable energy. This can be on-site on the building, or it can be off-site and procured to the building through various different agreements. And we need to be compensating for any residual emissions that are left. Maybe you have a gas cooker or a diesel generator, or you're connected to a fossil fuel-based grid. We need to be compensating for the emissions that we can't avoid after we've reduced them as much as we can. And then finally, plan for deep decarbonisation, particularly in existing buildings that require retrofitting and renovation. The same approach goes for embodied carbon, which is to reduce first, so prevent embodied carbon in the first place by prioritising the renovation of existing buildings before we choose to build new. And if we are going to build a new building, let's think about lean construction and fossil fuel-free construction, and how we optimize reductions of embodied carbon through design choices and material selection. And then plan for the future. So we think about how can we design buildings to be adaptable and future-proofed? How can we design them to be deconstructed at the end of their useful life? And then finally, again, compensating for residual emissions, because we cannot avoid embodied carbon emissions when we're building new buildings, but we can reduce them by as much as possible, and then we can do something about the emissions we're creating by compensating for them with high value and credible offset programs. So the Advancing Net Zero program and our whole life carbon vision sets out the dates by which we need to be achieving that total decarbonisation target for 2050. In the mainstream, we want to see that from 2030, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have at least 40% less embodied carbon with significant upfront carbon reduction. So that's the carbon that's created before a building is even used when it's first constructed. And that all new buildings must be net zero operational carbon. And then by 2050, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have net zero embodied carbon, and all buildings, including existing buildings, must be net zero operational carbon. But in order to achieve that mainstream vision and those dates, we require a huge shift in the way that we design our buildings, the way we use them, and the way we value them and the materials within them. So we've created this leadership track, which is the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment, which asks businesses and organizations to achieve those 2050 goals 20 years earlier. So by 2030, all their existing buildings have been taken action to reduce energy consumption and eliminate emissions, and that new developments and major renovations by 2030 achieve maximum reductions in embodied carbon, and then all residual emissions are compensated with those offsets. And that as leaders, as front runners in this transition, they should be advocating through their business activities for their entire supply chain to be, for all buildings to be net zero whole life carbon by 2050. The green building councils around the world that are involved in the Advancing Net Zero program are taking lots of action to ensure that their members are equipped with the knowledge and the tools and the resources to understand what that framework that I've just outlined means for a specific application within local context, taking into account the different considerations, the different climate, the different local conditions, and things like the current regulatory baselines. What sorts of actions need to be taken and how can they be tailored? And so all of these resources help respond to that specific local context and help provide that information. And it could be in the form of roadmaps or design competitions or rating tools or guidance for the industry. And lots of green building councils also run training programs and education schemes to help their members understand what this means for them and the way they design and operate their buildings. The reason that all of this is important is because it reinforces a concept called the ambition loop. We know that more enhanced and bolder regulation is necessary to help us apply these concepts at scale. And we also know that some of the solutions exist out there and that we need to scale up uptake in order to create the confidence in governments that the industry is ready to deliver against those enhanced regulations. So in order to see that regulation, which we know can't happen overnight, we need to see front-runner business action by companies setting ambitious science-based targets and updating publicly on that progress. They help create and send that really strong demand signal to governments that says, you know, we're ready for the challenge for bolder and more ambitious regulation. And then the governments will see that those targets being set, and perhaps they'll set a long-term net zero goal for all economies, of course, of which the built environment will be an important part. That then sends a signal back to business that, you know, if they're making these investments, then it's in alignment with government ambitions. And so that creates more investment, more targets, more confidence within those growth strategies and technologies needed to shift to a net zero economy. And then that creates more movement from policymakers. And often we see cities moving first. They might be able to set net zero plans and targets for their own buildings, their own schools and affordable housing, for example, as well as policy at a local level. And then eventually we start to see federal level governments bringing in regulations, incentives, and provide those timelines and market signals that hopefully lead to regulation requiring all buildings to be built this way in the future. And we call this the ambition loop. It's all about taking mutually reinforcing steps towards the same goal, because we cannot rely on government to solve this problem and save us from this challenge in the very short timeline that we need to be taking action. So that's why businesses and the GBCs equipping those businesses is such an important part of this process. So the net zero carbon building commitment requires companies, cities, states and regions to firstly commit to take leadership action, depending on what type of stakeholder they are, to then disclose their annual performance data, which helps us understand more about the challenge, to act on implementing a decarbonisation roadmap along the lines of the framework that I mentioned earlier, and then verify their progress towards net zero goals. And that could be through using rating tools or third-party verifications of portfolio level data. And then finally, advocate for wider emission reductions. This could be if you're a designer, for example, a design firm. All of the commitment requirements 1 through 4 are about your own buildings in your portfolio. Item 5 is about how you then apply those concepts to the projects that you are designing, for example. So the commitment has currently 140 businesses, plus 29 cities and 6 regions who are also either committing to take action on their own buildings or to implement regulation along those 2030 and 2050 timelines. And these represent, the map represents the signatories' locations, so they're all across the world. And it's really a case of demonstrating that this action is happening in all corners of the globe, and it's coming, it's happening, especially from a regulation point of view. And we're also showing growth within some of the markets that don't currently have signatories. So super exciting developments. Depending on what kind of business you are, whether you're an SME, an owner, a tenant or developer of buildings, or an investor, and hopefully you're at least one or more of those, there will be an initiative that's designed or tailored to suit you and your journey and support you along that journey to get to net zero. You could set a science-based target to achieve net zero across your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 2050 or sooner. You could sign up through the SME Climate Hub if you're an SME. And the way that we've positioned the commitment is that it's extremely complementary to those targets, because if you've set a 2050 or sooner goal for all of your emissions from your business, then you should and could take action to address the emissions from your buildings by 2030, because we know those solutions exist. And so the commitment sits nicely within this suite of initiatives and is very complementary. So we have a project that's happening at a regional level to help drive the uptake of net zero buildings. And it's the adaptation of the net zero readiness framework that was first created for the Asia Pacific region to look at its applicability for the Middle East and North Africa region. So this one, which was created by the Asia Pacific region, has 5 kind of key focus elements that are needed to accelerate the uptake of net zero, and each of them delivers guidance around how to work towards our goals. And for Asia Pacific, a region where we're expecting a huge growth within urban areas that already make up 60% of the world's population, it's extremely important that these concepts are applied. So the first one is government leadership, secondly finance, then we have data, technical solutions and approaches, and then finally mindset, a really important part of the shift and the transition. So the project for MENA is identifying the triggers and market levers needed to unlock action on delivering net zero targets within the MENA region, to increase confidence in the markets across the region in setting and achieving these net zero targets. And then finally, building a network of cross-regional experts to share solutions and visions, paving those pathways towards the common goal. And the good news is that we are seeing net zero buildings pop up all over the world, in all different countries, in different climates, different building types, different ranges right across the full spectrums of different buildings. This one here is from ALP, Africa Logistics Properties, our first commitment signatory from the Africa region. And this is a logistics hub that they have in Kenya, ALP North, which has achieved 41% of energy savings, 52% in water savings, and 50% reduction in embodied energy in its materials as well. And it's tracking its performance on an annual basis with how much carbon it's saving as a result. And so this is just an example of a project that's, within the Africa region that's applying these concepts of net zero because it makes business sense for them, and they're finding that they're able to do that at low or minimum cost against what they would have previously done under business as usual practices. So I hope to see more projects like this being applied across the Africa region, and especially within Egypt, as the potential and opportunities for net zero buildings are unlocked and we're taking more action towards net zero. And speaking of which, you can look out for our next Advancing Net Zero status report, which is coming out in the end of July, where we celebrate the progress that is made by GBCs and industry to inspire more action, and hopefully much more action within Egypt as well, because we can achieve our goals if we focus on those targets, we explore the opportunities for collaboration, and we work together to achieve net zero. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Inshallah next time. Thank you so much.